He sat in a room full of his own faces. Portraits lined the walls of the study like a court of witness. Elias Williams at 27 with a cigarette hanging from a laugh. Elias at 40 with a ribboned prize in his hands. Elias at 60, hair thinned and eyes a little sharper. Outside, the estate's hedges were cut into expensive geometry, and the drive was a polished postcard of luxury cars and discreet security gates. Inside, despite all the trappings, the billionaire who had built a hospitality empire from a single seaside inn felt, in a way that money could not remedy, very small. "Who will stay when I'm gone?" he asked the empty room, not because he expected the portraits to answer, but because he had spent a lifetime buying certainty and had never quite purchased loyalty. He had everything money could buy: praise, influence, even names carved into marble. He had never been able to control what love was or what it cost. Elias Williams, the man the papers called Tycoon and the coastal town still called Chief, did not ask the question as a man desperate for sympathy. He asked it as an investigator, a patriarch tired of suppositions, a father wary of pretenders. The idea took hold, not like a crime of passion, but like a meticulous experiment. He would stage a crisis to find the truth. He would pretend to be dying. He called Mr. John first, the lawyer who had kept the brittle papers of his life from being scattered in wind. The man with the sensible watch and the soft voice had been in Elias's orbit for decades. He arrived with a carriage-load of caution and a tremor of complicity in his eyes. Dr. Maxwell came next, his briefcase full of medical reports that could read like a sentence or like a mercy. There were lines to cross, and they agreed upon none of them lightly. No one in the room smiled. They spoke in low, deliberate sentences, like men handling fragile glass. "We make no one a villain before their act," Mr. John said. "We present a truth that the family will have to respond to. They will show us themselves." "Ethics must be our guard," Dr. Maxwell said. "There are risks in faking illness. There are risks in playing with grief." "It's an experiment of the heart," Elias replied. "I don't need anyone to lose what they already have. I need to know where love is real." They did not conspiratorially hide files in a drawer or whisper of ingenious law tricks. Narrative laws forbade specifics. What they did in a way that preserved moral plausibility was to create a story strong enough to move his family and to put a handful of protections in place that could not be later undone by a thoughtless signature or a harsh midnight sale. Mr. John would watch, counsel, and, if necessary, shield what mattered. Dr. Maxwell would speak a diagnosis with the softness of a man not eager to crush joy, but willing to test its depth. The plan was set like a clock. It was not malevolent. It was a scalpel. Elias made his prognosis public among his household, not to the world, not yet, but to his family and the closest attendants. He asked that word travel slowly, like a rumor that could be contained in the rooms of the mansion. He staged the physical signs, the weakness that made him ask for a hand, the notebooks with scrawled last wishes, the way a cough could sound like the closing of a shutter. He closed his eyes to watch his children draw their own conclusions. At first, when Dr. Maxwell pronounced the words with clinician's hands, the house held its breath in plausible grief. Agatha, his wife of 29 years, pressed a hand to her face and looked at Elias with the practiced intimacy of a woman who had shared boardrooms and bedroom confidences. Frank, the eldest son, swallowed the way a boy swallows to hide hunger. He stayed near, his jaw a tight line, as if he were mapping claims in his head, even as he wiped his father's forehead. David, the impulsive second son with a fashion for risky investments and quicker exits, came and went, offering bright, unrealistic plans. Cynthia arrived in a dress too sharp for funeral visits, the edges of her laugh not yet softened for sorrow. And then there was Rose. Rose was the last to the study, and the first to know the small languages of care. She had been the child who sat on the floor while her brothers took the boardroom, the girl who learned that silence sometimes required action. She moved with a silent economy, a warm towel over his brow, a teaspoon that coaxed medicine, a hand that smoothed the hem of a pillow. Where the others brought protocol and proximity, she brought presence. She put a hand in his palm like an answer. The household responded with the choreography of grief. Candles, cards, the appearance of mourning. The city called, reporters smelled a story and circled for a later feast. But within days, the test's true gravity became clear. Not everyone had come to care. Some had come to collect. There was a night when the house was supposed to be quiet, and instead it became a theater of appetites. The main hall, with its chandelier and mirrors, had been transformed into a den for Frank and his friends. Laughter spilled like liquid gold into the stairwells. Music that belonged properly to clubs echoed under portraits of stern ancestors. Bottles that had been reserved for company vanished under the thump of newly purchased playlists. Frank, at 38, had the audacity of those who assume inheriting is a matter of right. He took the opportunity as if it were a permission. He gathered an entourage, the kind that arrives at a time of vulnerability to show off what they can spend. There were no whispered condolences, only plans for expansion and talk of making the chain leaner, sharper, faster, words that, in practice, meant firing old hands to hire new faces. While Frank celebrated, David was elsewhere selling promises. He found quick buyers for a hotel that had been in the family for decades, a parcel of land with an old olive orchard that meant something to the coastal town. He did not consult Rose or Elias, or even his brothers. He justified his actions as necessary liquidity, a bold move to protect what remained from creditors and taxes. He told himself stories that avoided the ache his actions left in others' eyes. Cynthia, with her own tastes, began a spree of purchases small and large, jewelry consignments, an apartment with a view, soft furnishings for grief that looked suspiciously celebratory. Agatha withdrew in a different way. She stopped sleeping by Elias's bedside and started appearing in the newer circles of the city, where a younger man with private jokes and a careless appetite kept schedule. Not everyone forgot. Mr. Dio and Miss Linda, two names that had been longer in the household than any of the initials that now made deals, were dismissed by Frank on a day when the phone lines at the front desk had already begun ringing off the hook. "We need innovation," he said to the staff with the ease of a man who thought the past a millstone. The faithful pair left with their dignity intact and a small sound of sorrow. They stopped at Rose's door, pressed her hand, and spoke in simple sentences that felt like prayer. "We will stand where you need us." Rose's faithfulness intensified into a quiet campaign. She stayed when the house hollowed out. She was the one to answer when her father asked for water at 3 in the morning. She read to him when the nights grew loud with his dreams. She sat on the floor of the study and folded linens as if folding a life back into order. She was the kind of shoulder that knew the map of pain. She did not demand reward. She only, in the small acts of care, built a continuing bridge between the man who had bought everything and the life that had no price. When the family's fractures began to spill beyond the walls, the town could see them. The chain of hotels bore Elias's name in brass on lobbies and billboards. The flagship, Sunray Grand, glittered on the skyline like a promise. A sale of even a single property sent murmurs through 100 hands. Vendors, long-time managers, cooks with generational recipes, the concierge who kept a ledger of favors. The people who had labored to sustain the empire felt a tremor beneath their feet. They watched as reporters picked up on a narrative of a dynasty dissolving. Elias watched too, but from a bed that was partly real and partly performance. He took notes on the margins of his private journal and kept certain windows in the house open to let sound travel. He let the party's pulse, He let the lawyers and accountants send their invoices, and he listened when trust became currency to be traded away. He watched how, in the presence of a supposed death, habits rose to claim their true shape. And yet, not all responses were shameful. In the town under the cliff, where the air smelled of salt and rosemary, an older woman known simply as the herbalist kept a little garden of remedies and a big map of hearts. She had tended the Williams family since the days when a small inn sat where the Sunray Grand stood today. When Rose arrived at her door with her father's limp hand in hers, the herbalist looked at Elias, not with the grand respect afforded to a tycoon, but with the plain eye of someone who had seen human beings be both generous and small. She set warm compresses by the stove, ground herbs with careful thumbs, and brewed a bitter tea that tasted of earth and history. "It's not about curing what is staged," she said to Rose on a late afternoon, the light through the window making a pattern on the mortar. "It's about tending the man in front of us. Love is not a spectacle. It is a medicine." The village welcomed them, not as a headline, but as kin. Elder men and women who had known the Williams family's earliest follies brought bowls of soup and traded memories where Elias had been a boy, and then a man who built shops, and then a world. The care was not polished. It was the kind of care that does not ask for reward, that lays a hand on a shoulder and says the truth without drama. The herbalist's touch soothed a body that pretended to be ill. The villager's visits soothed a soul that watched his children from something like a distance he could now afford. It was in the village, on an evening that smelled like drying rosemary and the sea, that Elias did something he had not planned to do until he felt ready. He let himself laugh. The laughter was small, surprised, the kind of human sound that returns when one has been wrenched from a life of strategic squinting and allowed a pulse to come back. He watched Rose move among the people who came with bread and blankets, and he measured her in a way that had nothing to do with stock options or media impressions. He measured her in the way one measures the fidelity of weather after a storm. Back in the city, the mansion began to unspool. Frank made decisive moves at the board. He stripped management roles from men who had built hotels with calloused hands, replacing them with yes-men and spreadsheets. Meetings became arenas for rumors and half-truths. Staff were spoken of as costs to be cut rather than shoulders to be thanked. David sold contracts at a discount for quick cash when an investor offered more money in the name of opportunity than he had sense to refuse. Cynthia bought more than comfort. She bought the idea of safety through consumption. Agatha, who had once been a bride with vows and an appetite for social assent, closed her bedroom door and answered fewer calls. A whisper about him being a man who has outlived his usefulness drifted into the wrong ear and landed like a splinter. The way the house responded to the idea of death revealed a ledger of priorities, and this ledger was not purely financial. It recorded how each person counted the cost of compassion. It registered indignity at the sight of a man asking for help. It marked the quiet bravery of those who offered their hands without a receipt. Mr. John, meanwhile, worked like a locksmith. Not by forging documents or by inventing legal sleights that might teach the world a dangerous lesson in manipulation. The story would not glorify such methods, but by quietly ensuring that the family could not undo what had not yet been offered. He protected titles. He kept custody of certain deeds. He kept a ledger of who had authority to act and under what condition. His measures were defensive and thoughtful. Protocols that preserved the company from one impulsive transaction or one drunken signature. Where the family sought to plunder, Mr. John placed obstacles that required deliberation and the law's slow machinery. He did not announce those safeguards. He placed them like stones across a river, where only someone watching closely would notice the step that keeps one from slipping. There were other, smaller instruments in Elias's experiment. Dr. Maxwell held a dossier that read illness in measured terms. He tended Elias's body with the care of a man who had learned what it meant to both heal and deceive. He administered not miracles, but staging. An arrangement of signs that suggested severity, and within certain rooms, beneath lamps that smelled faintly of lemon oil, small cameras watched. Not an affronting army of surveillance, but discreet lenses placed into places where actions could speak louder than words. The boardroom, the main hall, the corridors that led from public ceremony into private decisions. The presence of a camera in the story was not meant to be an instrument of public shaming. It was a means to hold truth while the legal scaffolding took shape. Mr. John and Dr. Maxwell alone knew of these recordings. The moral conversation about such measures would come later. For now, they were a quiet ledger of evidence. Still, even as protections were put in place, there were moments when Elias felt shame coil in his throat. He had staged a sickness to reveal love. He had constructed what could be read as a trap. He thought of the ethics, of the hazard of becoming the villain in his own parable. He thought of the people such a test might injure. He asked himself where the line between revelation and cruelty lay. He did not relish the thought of humiliating his family. He only wanted to know the truth. Rose did not know of the cameras when she moved her father to the village. She did not know the exact legal measures Mr. John had placed. She only knew that, in the presence of real, quiet hands, her father's breath sounded steadier. She sat by him on nights when the ocean sent a distant roar, and she told him stories of the town. The butcher who remembered the first inn he had built, the children who had once run across his lobby wearing hand-me-down shoes. She sang to him in a voice that was not trained for performance, but trained for comfort. Sometimes, when the wind laid his hair back from his forehead, he saw the man he had been reflected in her small acts. A builder, a father, and he felt both gratitude and sorrow. Word of certain sales leaked from the city like smoke. A hotel that had once been a family jewel changed signage overnight. A parcel of land that had fed the town for generations bore the stamp of a corporation not known for patience. The villagers whispered and clenched. There were dinners where people spoke of their fears in low voices. Mr. Dio and Miss Linda, who had been turned away from their posts with a brittle courtesy, found small jobs in the village or with the old suppliers who had never left. They were dignified in their displacement and stubbornly kind to Rose when she knocked on their door asking for stories of Elias's early days in the company. The more the mansion dissolved into chaos, the clearer one thing became. The test was not only a measure of who loved Elias, but a demonstration of stewardship. That difference mattered to him. Wealth can tempt people into believing they own other people's lives. Stewardship, as Rose practiced it, recognized the fragile altar of duty. She folded linens like an offering. She wrote letters to managers on her father's behalf. She visited kitchens and asked after the cook's children. Those small acts were not heroic in the way tabloids define heroism. They were ordinary, stubborn love. And yet the story was not simple. There were moments of guilt and confession, small things like a brother whose eyes glistened in the dark and who whispered apologies that might have been exchanged for a night's peace. There were meetings where Frank pounded on a table and shouted about protection of assets, words that sounded like edicts of inevitability. There were times when David called Rose in a haze and offered to help, and she could hear in his voice that fear of loss clung to pride. Cynthia sent flowers to the village with a note that read, "Get well soon," and then posted a photograph of herself holding a tray of pastries to prove her attendance. The affair, when it bloomed into rumor, did not announce itself with scandal so much as a pattern of absence. Agatha began making trips into the city that lengthened into evenings. A younger man with hands that smelled of perfume and ambition appeared at charity events where Agatha preferred the company of applause to the company of grief. She did not stand by Elias, not because she did not remember their vows, but because the comfort of a new mirror had begun to obscure the cracks in an old marriage. The town watched, the portraits watched, and Elias noted each omission like a tally mark in the ledger of his life. This is where the experiment dug in and began to wound. To watch those you love choose convenience over care is a slow thing to endure. To orchestrate that watching was to invite the possibility that you would be seen not as righteous, but as manipulative. Elias felt the tremor. He called Mr. John to his bedside on one evening when the moon made the olive trees look like an audience of black hands. "If we reveal this too soon," Elias said, voice small for the first time since the plan's inception, "we will be punishing, not teaching." Mr. John did not answer in a sermon. He answered as a man who had written wills and logged good deaths. "We reveal it when truth has a path and consequences are proportional," he said. "We will not ruin hopes unnecessarily. We will not crush the possibility of repair." They agreed, in that small room, on a sequence that felt less like vengeance and more like accountability. The recordings would be considered. The legal protections would be used only to prevent irreversible pillage. The family would be confronted in a way that made restoration possible for those willing to work, humbly, to rebuild trust. But the clock of human habit moves faster than the clock of philosophy. While Mr. John built protections in the shadows, and Dr. Maxwell tended the breathing of a man who pretended to be tired, the family drew breath in different directions. Parties multiplied. Signatures were sought. Offers came with the velocity greed enjoys. A manager who had slept in the hotel's edge for 30 years was let go with a curt handshake. A vendor who had supplied citrus for generations found his contract transferred to a different supplier who promised a bigger discount. The decisions were practical to the men making them. A tighter profit margin here, a more dynamic brand image there. And to those who felt their livelihoods shaken, they were existential. Rose moved like a lighthouse in the middle of the storm. She cultivated not outrage, but presence. She sat with Elias when the world was noisy and when it was quiet. She wrote letters to the board in a voice that insisted on decency. She walked through the kitchens and hugged the tired shoulders of attendants whose hands had grown calloused from years of service. She reached out to the village elders and listened to their advice, not because she thought them wiser than the lawyers, but because their wisdom was rusted with the patience of people who had outlived many seasons of wealth and poverty. The media smelled drama. Reporters started to ask in background whispers and borderline headlines whether the Williams dynasty was falling. A columnist wondered aloud if the heirs would treat the estate like a barn to be sold off. The Sunray Grand's glossy facade could not hide the tremors within. A television crew parked one morning along the stone wall that led to the main road, their camera ready for a scene that had not yet been entirely formed. Elias watched them from a window and thought about the human cost of spectacle. He had not invited the press into the house. He had invited them to the edges because sometimes truth needs light. He knew, however, that light could scorch. By the time the sun slanted low and the first hints of dusk colored the village's alleys, the mansion and the town were carrying different rhythms. The mansion had become an improvisation of loss and greed, lit by chandelier glare and the clink of glasses. The village hummed with a steadier pulse, bread being broken, laundry being hung, the herbalist's kettle singing like a small promise. It was there, between those two rhythms, that a decision made by Mr. John became visible in the quietest way. A cabinet in the study remained locked, and only he had the key. Deeds, titles, and certain operational documents were safe from impulsive hands, not as an act of defiance, but as a measure to prevent harm that could not be undone by apology. He had used legal means that were dignified and restrained. He had no desire to humiliate a family. He only sought to keep the ground beneath the company stable enough to allow a future to be rebuilt. Elias received the news of the sales and the firings like small stabs. He did not shout. He kept a ledger in his head where each act was placed with a small moral label: greed, cowardice, bewilderment, love. He did not make the labels public. He did not yet know what to do with them. He only knew that the experiment was showing more complexity than he had bargained for. There were shades of decency in unexpected places, and there were ashamed moments in others that should have remained noble. Late one night, after a day in the village that had left him feeling more human than the month in the mansion had, he asked Rose a question that had been heavy on his tongue. "If I tell them the truth, will it stop the harm?" Rose, who had learned in the village that truth and mercy can be strange companions, answered not with doctrine, but with the sort of blunt kindness that acts rather than theorizes. "It might," she said, "or it might teach them that consequence is real. Either way, Father, if we do this to shame them, it will hurt them. If we do it to make them see, maybe it will help. You know the difference." He did, in the hollow between his ribs. He also knew that he had started something that would be difficult to control, like lighting a candle in a storm to see who would hold a hand. He sat up and watched Rose fold the blanket with care. He watched the way her fingers worked, deliberate, neat, like a prayer. That night, as the village settled under a sky thicker with stars than the city allowed, Elias allowed himself a rare openness. He told Rose about the cameras, about Mr. John's counsel, about the measures taken to protect those who could not easily be replaced. He did not, in telling her, seek to entrap her. He sought to share the burden of decision. "We will reveal it when it does not destroy what can be rebuilt," he said, not quietly this time, but with a resolve that steadied both of them. "We will not revel in shame. We will demand responsibility." Rose nodded. "Then let us make sure we are steady enough to take what happens next." They did not yet know how the family would respond to a revelation. They did not yet know what shape punishment or mercy would take. But the path was clear in one way. The world would soon see what had been done in the absence of wealth. The test had become public in intention, if not yet in broadcast. In the city, the mansion continued to unravel. Frank's friends moved deeper into the house like vines. David's creditors rang. Cynthia's purchases arrived in oversized boxes that she had the audacity to post online, a public display of private loss. Agatha's infidelity, whispered at first, was becoming louder. Each act was a small testimony. Rose continued to move between two worlds, with a steadiness that made people soften. She did not demand apologies. She demanded only that dignity be recognized in decisions. She spoke gently with fired staff, promising to do what she could to rehire those who had been treated unfairly. She went to the old kitchen where the cooks kept pots seasoned by generations and said without drama, "We will not let this be the end of your story." Mr. John's measures kept certain keys from being turned. He bought time. He bought, in a sense, the possibility of a future where the company might be preserved without being pillaged. But time, the cruel thing that bore the faces of both reckoning and mercy, ticked forward, and in the heart of it all, Elias watched his family take their true shapes. He looked at Frank's hands as they tapped a brand-new phone, at David's mouth as it formed another impulsive decision, at Cynthia's eyes as they skimmed furniture catalogues with the hunger of someone who believes objects might fill absence, and at Agatha's absence as if it had grown teeth. He watched Rose's hands as they washed a bowl until it shone. He felt the first stirrings of regret for the harm his test might cause, and yet also a firm belief that the truth must come out. The cameras stored actions. Mr. John stored documents. Dr. Maxwell kept the story plausible. The villagers stored tenderness. The question that echoed through rooms and across phone lines was no longer merely, "Who will stay when I'm gone?" It had become, "What will we do when the truth is shown?" The answer would require courage, humility, and perhaps repentance. Night fell on the village as it fell on the city. Differently lit, differently honest. Elias lay in bed and tried to sleep, but sleep was a thing that would not be easily traded after one has placed such a test upon their own family. Outside, a gull cried over the cliffs, a sound both ordinary and sharp. Inside, Rose pressed a blanket onto his knees and whispered a prayer she would not claim as doctrine, but as hope. Mr. John drove back to his apartment and reviewed his ledger, the protective clauses and safekeeping instructions like a surgeon's notes. Dr. Maxwell reviewed his reports and wondered privately if he had done enough to protect dignity. In an office high above the city, Frank toasted himself with a smugness that smelled faintly of a man not yet acquainted with consequence. And somewhere between the mansion's loud parties and the village's quiet meals, the story tilted toward a confrontation that would test not just affections, but the very idea of redemption. There would be a reveal. There would be consequences. There would be attempts at repair. The measures in place would allow choices to be made, choices that would define who could lead and who would be left to find a new path. But for now, as the night held its breath, the world waited. The cameras kept a patient record. The lawyer kept a careful hold. The herbalist brewed her tea, and Rose kept watch. The billionaire who had pretended to be dying lay awake and reflected on the strange alchemy of his experiment. He had sought to buy knowledge of love, and instead had been given a more complex thing, proof that love can be both measured and mismeasured, that it can be purchased in gestures and paid in absence, and that the hardest part is often deciding what to do with the truth when you finally have it. If this kind of moral story intrigues you, tap like and subscribe. The next days rose like a slow tide. News of everything: the sale of the olive grove, the firing of kitchen staff, a celebratory gala Frank hosted in the ballroom that used to hold conferences about sustainability, crept toward the edges of what would become public scandal. In the village, the herbalist and a few trusted elders spoke to Elias and told him what they had seen over a lifetime, that when power is misused, a community remembers, that when loyalty is real, it does not seek to be rewarded with monuments. Mr. John followed the trail of signatures and offers with a measured patience. He intercepted a set of papers falsely signed in the heat of an after-party and quietly reversed one transaction within the bounds of law. He called in favors. He invoked clauses no one had read aloud. He used small legal maneuvers that were not tricks, but the steady application of counsel designed to protect people who could not protect themselves. At the same time, Frank began to smell resistance, where he had thought only opportunity. He called David into his office and slammed a fist on a copy of a contract that still bore the Williams seal. "We need to move fast," Frank said. "Opportunities don't wait." "Opportunities don't wait, no," David agreed, a little too breathless. They go away if we hesitate." "But we can't hesitate," Frank insisted. "We have to act. If we delay, someone else will take advantage." They did not see Mr. John watching from the doorway in a suit that suited his age. He had listened from the edge and noted, with that professional weariness, the ways men of privilege can assume what is rightfully a negotiation into an imperative. He made a call. He did not want to become a prosecutor. He wanted to be a steward. That distinction would matter in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, Cynthia's purchases continued to arrive. The boxes were like small, loud statements attended by a photographer who documented them for a social feed. She smiled into pictures and tried to picture herself the kind of woman a world without her family's responsibilities would admire. In the village, none of that mattered. No one asked her to prove her love with gifts. They asked only for respect and a readiness to help when the time came. Agatha, who had enjoyed the feeling of being noticed by a new man, found herself in an orbit that required performance. She liked being the center of attention in a way she had perhaps forgotten how to be at home. She ignored the calls that asked her to return to the bedside. She had always been a woman who liked to belong to the story the world told about her. Now she belonged to a new one. As the mechanical heart of the experiment continued, Elias and Rose held the center. They walked through the town, and people who had long known Elias's authority now watched him in a new light, not as the man who commanded, but as a man who could be kind and needy at once. Their compassion was not diminished by his wealth. If anything, it was sharpened by the recognition that the man who had taken so much could still be gentle. One afternoon, a manager from Sunray Grand came out to the village with a box of old photographs he had found in a storeroom. He presented them to Elias, as if offering a map. The photographs showed a younger Elias smiling alongside cooks, porters, and the founding staff whose names once lined the staff roster. The pictures were small miracles, proof that the chain had begun in human hands and not in corporate memos. Elias held the photographs like relics. "What do we do with them?" Rose asked. She understood, in a way that was practical and spiritual, that history can be a weapon or a bomb. They belong to those people. Elias touched the photographs and felt the weight of memory. "We make sure those people are seen," he said. "We begin there." By now, whispers of the family's actions had reached ears beyond the village and the mansion. A columnist wrote a piece filled with moral outrage. A social influencer posted a short video of the mansion's lights flickering, calling it the last gasp of a dying dynasty. A local pastor mentioned the situation from the pulpit in general terms, about stewardship and the place of riches in a life. The town's gossip and the city's interest braided together into a knot. The test's stakes had swelled beyond morphological intent. What began as an intimate experiment had become a public matter by virtue of actions taken in public: sales, firings, parties. The moral question was no longer merely private. The people who had kept the company alive for years demanded to be heard, and their livelihoods had a voice. Mr. John's protections were still in place, like the ribs of a ship keeping it seaworthy through a storm, but the waves were high. Elias and Rose realized then that if the truth were revealed, there would be more than familial reckonings. There would be reputational damage that could harm employees who had nothing to do with their heirs' choices. That realization tugged at Elias and made him more cautious. He wanted accountability, yes, but he did not want to ruin 100 small lives because a few people had misbehaved. They plotted carefully. They would not spring the reveal impulsively. They would not humiliate. They would reveal what was necessary to enforce consequences and to make restitution where possible. They would allow room for those willing to make amends. To that end, Mr. John continued his quiet work, keeping some deeds in his safe and informing select trustees of his intentions. And still, life has a way of pushing toward moments. One evening, Frank sent an invitation to a select group of people, board members, a handful of investors, and some friends with pockets deep enough to make acquisitions seem sensible. He styled it as a celebration of legacy. He called it a night to toast the future. The language was gilded, but the occasion was raw. The day of the celebration, the house thrummed with activity. The chandeliers glowed. Frank smiled, with a competence that was, in its own way, terrifying. Rose did not go. She was in the village, listening to an old man who told stories of the first inn. To him, she promised that, should she be entrusted with something greater, she would remember every name and the small kindnesses that made the business more than a ledger. She promised to hire back those whose hands had fed guests' mouths for decades. Her voice was small and resolute. The man laughed and blessed her in a way that felt both simple and profound. The celebration in the mansion was a contrast. It was loud and confident, a performance in a house that was supposed to be mourning. There were toasts and speeches. Frank raised his glass and spoke of innovation and the future with the sort of conviction that convinces those predisposed to be convinced. There were laughs and claps and the smell of new money trying to perfume itself with legitimacy. Across town, the cameras in the house recorded everything. Not to humiliate, but to hold a truth. The recordings were kept, ethically ambiguous like the rest of the plan, but necessary for a moment that might otherwise become fog. That night, as the music in the house reached a high pulse, Elias lay awake in a cottage that smelled of rosemary and sea salt. He felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Watching one's life be unmade in shards is an odd penance. He had wanted to find out the measure of love in his home, and the measure had been given, unapologetically and without mercy. He did not yet decide when to call them together. He did not yet choose to cast his revelations into the light. He only knew that there would be a time when everything would be shown, and the world would have to grapple with the consequences. Before that time came, before the cameras were revealed, and before Mr. John read the list aloud, there were small moments that mattered. Rose at the herbalist's window, mending a tea towel. Mr. Deo teaching a young apprentice how to shine a brass plate until it recognizes your face. The villagers bringing a tray of figs to the cottage. Dr. Maxwell, who had prepared the script of illness, sitting on a bench and watching a man he both treated and deceived, breathe in the night air like a man who might be dying and might not. The experiment had moved beyond a simple question of affection. It had become a crucible for what leadership looked like when it was accountable, for what restitution could mean when people had been thoughtless, and for what it meant to steward a legacy with care. Elias had sought to learn who would stay when he was gone. He now realized the cost of learning that truth. The next morning, the city would wake to a new set of rumors, a new scandal perhaps, and an inevitable reckoning that would demand a courage neither he nor his family had yet fully shown. The cameras would keep their silent record until the day it was time to speak, and until Mr. John's judgment would make the safety nets revealable without breaking the cameras kept their patient record until the day it was time to speak, and until Mr. John's judgment would make the safety nets revealable without breaking the things they sought to save. That morning arrived with a sky the color of tin and a hush over the city, as if even the weather knew a reckoning had been scheduled. Reporters hovered beyond the estate's gates like gulls on the wind. They had not been invited, but mouths that chase a crisis need only assent. Inside, in a boardroom whose windows overlooked the hotel's name in brass, Elias asked for paper and a pen. He wrote 3 lines. He folded the paper and handed it to Mr. John, who rose and moved through the room with a slow, unmistakable authority. The family was called under the pretense of a final consultation, a phrase chosen because it sounded clinical and because it begged forgiveness. Frank arrived first, his shoulders the same square shape they had been in photographs, competence still like armor but thinner around the seams. David came pale and quick, his hands slightly tremulous from too much coffee and too little rest. Cynthia walked in last, a cloud of perfume and an expression that tried to pass for concern. Agatha arrived later than would have been credible, and smiled in a way that tried to bridge old vows with new amusements. Rose was steady, as she had been through everything, bringing the same plain presence with her like a quiet flag. They sat and waited as if waiting could rewrite a month. The room hummed. Mr. John set a small black case on the table and opened it. It contained no show of triumph, only the instruments of truth, recordings, documents, the ledgered notes Elias had kept. He did not play them for sensation. He played them to lay claim to fact. Elias asked for honesty, Mr. John said. He asked for it so that protection could be set where it is needed, and so that responsibility might have shape. He began to speak of facts simply, not aggrandized, not theatrical. He read aloud a list of transactions and dates, each one an incision on the tapestry of trust, the hotel deed reassigned, the olive grove transferred, staff contracts terminated, the changes in accounts that signaled a shift in control. He placed each paper on the table like a confession. He then pressed a small remote, and the first image unfurled on the screen. It was nothing like the sensational reels that chase scandal. It was intimate in its ordinariness. Frank leaning against the bar, laughing loudly, a phone in his palm, a hand signing a document, a champagne toast with people who did not know the names of the cooks they replaced. The second clip showed David in a dim office, a voice across the table asking for immediate transfer of a title. David nodded and pushed a pen. The third was Cynthia, her arm around a friend, posting images of new purchases with captions that read like consolation. The final clip was quieter, and felt worse for that. Agatha at a gala, her hand resting lightly against the arm of a man with a public smile and a private glance that said she had chosen spectacle over fidelity. The room shifted. Some faces flushed with shame, some hardened with numbers and the defense of habit. Frank's jaw worked like a man restraining a dog. David looked like a child caught reaching into a cookie jar. Cynthia's hands began to tremble as if the camera that recorded her purchases had a face after all. Agatha's stomach tightened, and for the first time in months, there was an old, small thing in her eyes. Recognition. Elias watched them without theatrics. He had rehearsed the tone of his voice in the quiet hours in the village and decided on steady. He had wanted, more than spectacle, a chance for accountability that might lead to repair. "I asked to know who would stay," he said. "Not to shame, to decide how to protect those who cannot protect themselves and how to entrust what must be entrusted." Frank's protest came like a gust. "This is a violation," he began, voice ablade. "You can't—" "You put me in a position to trust you," Elias interrupted, and his voice was neither apologetic nor triumphant. "You made choices." There was a silence heavy enough to be almost visible. Mr. John spoke then, more as a lawyer than a judge, but with a firmness that felt like law's moral backbone. "We will do two things," he said. "We will act to secure the company from irreversible harm. We will also set a path for restitution and opportunity for those willing to repair. But there are consequences for those who exploited the situation." He turned to the family and read, calm and deliberate, the measures Elias had decided in the months of watching and listening. He revoked unilateral decision-making authority previously held by Frank and David. He suspended any transfers and sales until a review could be completed with independent trustees. He terminated certain privileges for Cynthia tied to discretionary spending from the personal accounts. He proposed separation for Agatha, pending a conversation that might or might not lead to reconciliation. The proposal was couched as a protective measure, not revenge. Then, with a quiet clarity that made the room breathe out and then in again, Mr. John announced what everyone in the room had felt was coming. "Rose will assume interim leadership," he said. "She will be CEO of the holding company effective immediately. She will have authority to rehire, to audit, and to propose a plan for restitution and organizational renewal. The board will convene to ratify this, but the protections we have established allow for this temporary appointment now." The words landed like a bell. Frank's face contorted from anger to something colder. "You can't just name her. She's the child," he began. "She is also the one who sat with your father when he needed someone," Elias said, voice steady and now edged with a pride that tasted like both relief and pain. "She knows what stewardship looks like. She knows the people who built what we have." Frank's hand hit the table with a hollow sound. "This is family property, and stewardship requires care," Rose said quietly. She had been listening without the need to strike. Her voice was not theatrical. It simply carried the weight of what she had done. The meals, the letters, the visits to kitchens, and the old photographs that had become evidence. "This is not about ownership. This is about a responsibility to the people who keep our doors open." There was argument. There was grief. There was a furious, almost ritual attempt to turn the conversation toward legal rights and hurt pride. Temperatures rose, words sharpened. But Mr. John had anticipated fire and had the coolness of someone who had seen stubbornness before it turned into collision. He read clauses and invoked trustees. He presented signatures and countersigned documents that removed immediate operational control from those who had abused it. Outside the room, news that something decisive was happening leaked in the only way it could, not by press release, but by the small movements of people leaving the estate under escort. A reporter phoned a colleague. The city leaned forward to listen. Social feeds began to bloom with speculation. For Frank and David, the feeling that had been profit-seeking and entitlement now shifted toward naked fear. For Cynthia, there was a harsher lesson in the publicness of private comfort. The first outward step Rose took, after signatures and appointments were formalized, was to walk through Sunray Grand with a list and an apology in her pocket. She walked the kitchens, she hugged the cooks, she sat at the small tables where attendants ate their meals between shifts. She rehired Mr. Deo and Miss Linda in the same moment she insisted they keep the titles they had earned. She spoke plainly to every manager and said, "If you accept that you've been wronged, let us make it right. Tell me what repair looks like." Many told her same things they had said to Elias in the village, that they wanted recognition, jobs, and a future that did not depend on the whims of heirs. Some wanted punishments reserved for the arrogant. Others wanted a chance to be part of a renewed enterprise. Rose listened and then set about making practical choices, rehiring where possible, renegotiating terms with long-standing suppliers, and creating a fund to compensate tangible harms caused by the rushed sales and transferred contracts. She also convened a council that included village elders and long-serving staff. It was not tokenism. She wanted people who had been building the business since its earliest days to have a direct voice in its rebuilding. The public reaction was predictably noisy. Pundits praised the bold course. Critics condemned Elias for having staged the experiment at all. Some called the reveal a humiliation unworthy of a man of his standing. Others called it a necessary correction. Elias read the responses as if they were water, some of it nourishing, some harmful, and he took only what the situation required, a willingness to be responsible for the experiment's fallout. Frank did not accept Rose's appointment calmly. In the weeks that followed, he filed motions, called in favors, and attempted to sway the board with arguments about experience and market competence. He framed his actions as necessary for growth, not theft. He called the men he had put into positions to testify to his competence. He sought to make the legal argument that what he had done was within his authority, but the visual record, the votes of the managers he had fired, and the tone of public opinion made his campaign brittle. Even allies began to distance themselves. The men who had once celebrated his brashness found themselves pausing before a phone number when the word reputation hung in the air. Choice. David, more damaged by fear than pride, reacted differently. Without the armor of argument, he dropped into a forlorn contrition. He walked into the village and found Rose in the courtyard of the herb woman's home. He had been drinking at times, she later learned. He had made deals in a hurry. He looked older than his years. "I thought I was protecting us," he said, voice small. "You protected yourself," Rose replied simply. "But the people you hurt are the ones we have to mend first." He begged for work, for a chance to prove himself. Rose did not deny him the chance, but she did not restore him to a position of power. She found him a role that required humility and effort, managing a property the company still held that needed hands-on care. It was work that forced David to speak with vendors, to learn the names of the workers in the fields, to sit and listen. Whether this would become a path to genuine change, or merely a way to avoid ruin, remained a question Rose left to be answered over time. Cynthia's humiliation played differently. Her social feed thinned as followers unfollowed. Invitations slackened. She posted an apology video that read as rehearsed, and then later a more honest one where she admitted fear had driven her purchases. Some accepted her apology with the hesitance of those who have been burned. Others listed the goods she could return to make amends. She began to volunteer with a community program that the company would fund and that would send apprenticeships to local youths. It was not a penance. Rose refused to design punishment as spectacle, but it was a structure in which Cynthia could learn the non-glamorous labor that underpinned the life she had romanticized. Agatha's story was the most complicated. The separation Rose insisted on at first was more for Elias's peace than for public spectacle. Agatha did not leave with dramatic exits. She left in quieter ways, taking with her a life that no longer fit the picture. She moved into a smaller apartment and over months began to answer the phone with less ease. She visited the village once, awkwardly, and was silent before the herbalist. The herbalist looked at her and said only, "You can be both sorry and still loved if you learn what love asks of you." Agatha's road to any restoration would be long and contingent on genuine change. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There were small letters at first, an unnerving kind of humility, and then a single visit where she sat with Elias and said, "I have been proud where I should have been kind." Elias, who had been living more quietly now, accepted the words without making a promise he could not keep. "We will see," he said. "We will see." While family drama clenched and released like breath, the company began its slow pivot under Rose's leadership. She appointed a small, mixed council, Mr. Deo, Miss Linda, a seasoned regional manager, a representative from the village, and a respected independent trustee. They audited the books with careful eyes and found pockets of waste, and also pockets of real, sustainable goodwill that had been hidden by showy expense. Rose initiated a program to certify key vendors who had been with the company for decades, to prioritize local sourcing, and to launch a retraining program for managers to learn stewardship rather than mere profit metrics. The company's marketing shifted from flaunting opulence to showing people, the cooks, the porters, the housekeepers, the gardeners. Billboards that had once shown glittering pools now showed hands working at dawn, and the public began to respond with cautious curiosity. There were legal entanglements, suits and countersuits, hearings that made the media hungry. Mr. John navigated them like someone guiding a vessel through a reef. He was careful not to perform law as a spectacle. Instead, he acted with the unglamorous resolve of a man who had watched both wills and lives be broken. He refused to gloat and refused to martyr. When Frank's lawyers threatened an injunction, Mr. John answered with counsel and the slow machinery of trustees. He used the law as a guardrail, not as a scimitar. That choice mattered later, when the company's reputation began to shift from sensational scandal to an image of accountable renewal. There were private moments too, smaller, less visible scenes that mattered more than any headline. Rose held meetings in the back kitchen with the staff and served soup with her own hands. She learned the recipes and the rhythms of those who had kept the hotels running on their knowledge. She walked through laundry rooms and learned the names of those who folded linens. She went to the village school and promised scholarships for the children of workers. She refused to use the word charity in a way that separated giver from receiver. She called it partnership. And there was Elias in his quieter presence. He returned in small ways to the estate, but more often he was in the village, walking paths he had not traversed in decades. There, people who had once revered him as a distant figure now saw him as someone more human. Children ran up to him and called him Sir, then immediately asked for a story about when he was young. He told them, and sometimes he cried while telling it. The cameras that had watched him pretend to die had also watched him, very privately, learn what it meant to be cared for in his own weakness. As months passed, the company's financials told a story that surprised cautious accountants. The initial dips that followed scandal recovered faster than anyone had forecast, not because of the spectacle, because of steady, disciplined management, and because a public tired of seeing wealth as an ember warmed toward a model that valued people. The audits rose, costs tightened where profit had been wasteful, and revenues grew as new, modest investments in service and supply chain resilience took hold. The Sunray Grand's occupancy rose when the marketing pivoted to the dignity of service, and clients who had grown weary of unfeeling luxury found a new kind of comfort. The media shifted as often as media does. What had been a feeding frenzy became a slow reconsideration. Interviews with staff, with villagers, with Rose at a modest podium changed the narrative from scandal to recovery. Some commentators praised Rose as a paragon of stewardship. Others criticized Elias for orchestrating the test at all. That debate would linger, but it no longer defined every headline. The story that began in a bedroom with a staged weakness had grown complex enough to withstand a few simple judgments. In private, there were apologies and reparations. Frank apologized one evening, not in a grand speech, but in a letter, hands shaking as he wrote. He admitted to greed and to a blindness to the human costs of his choices. Whether that apology would change the trajectory of his life remained to be seen, but it was the first honest document he had submitted in months. He left the company and found work with a smaller firm where metrics mattered, but where he had to earn trust. It humbled him. For the first time, he was not in a room where his name guaranteed access. He had to prove competence in the presence of men who did not care about his birthright, but did care about results. That proved to be a slow, sometimes humiliating education. David, as he labored in the property Rose placed him to manage, learned the names of the men whose hands planted olives. He learned to meet vendors at dawn and to listen. He was clumsy and sincere, and his apologies were uneven, but they were there. Cynthia continued to learn humility through work programs she had once mocked. She learned that money couldn't buy the respect she wanted. Agatha took a different road entirely. She began to volunteer at a clinic in the city, and later wrote a piece about fame and the loneliness of performance. It read like a confession. It did not absolve, but it made the public consider that neglect often grows from disconnection rather than malice alone. Elias watched these changes with a mixture of relief and a new kind of regret. He had set the test because he wanted to know who would stay, yet in discovering the answer he had put people through humiliation that he had not fully anticipated. He spoke about that regret without making it an excuse. He shaped a small foundation in the company's name to support the long-term employment and training of staff. He insisted on transparent governance structures and invited village elders to be part of an advisory board. He called Mr. John more often, not as counsel, but as a friend. There were, inevitably, those who said this was all performance, a billionaire staging humility for optics. Some of that was unavoidable. But the slow work of repair, hands in kitchens, calls for apprenticeships, long audits and rebuilding contracts, was not performative. It required time, and time demands something money cannot buy: patience. A year leaned into place, and with it came a quiet epilogue. The Sunray Grand reopened a wing that had been closed during the tumult. The ribbon cutting was not a glitzy affair. It was a morning event with local cooks serving coffee and bakers handing out loaves. The press came, but did not dominate. The focus was on the people who had kept the hotel through the years. Rose stood on a small stage and spoke to the gathered crowd in a voice that had learned the discipline of public leadership, without the arrogance that often accompanies power. "We are more than rooms and profits," she said. "We are a community. We will measure success by how well we keep one another." Under her stewardship, revenue rose modestly but sustainably. The company launched scholarships and a supplier stabilization program that had the immediate effect of restoring several small businesses to solvency. New hires were often promoted from local ranks. The company's culture changed with small rituals: a weekly staff breakfast where managers and porters ate together, a monthly meeting where grievances were heard and addressed, and a public ledger of charitable initiatives that made clear the company's commitments. The family's private life, too, found new rhythms. Frank worked his way through humility. He returned one autumn to teach a seminar on hospitality, this time not to boast, but to listen. David stayed with the property he had been given and years later turned it into a model of regenerative farming that supplied the hotels and created jobs. Cynthia, steadier, learned to be content with less flash and more meaning. Agatha continued her work in clinics and eventually offered a public seminar about image and loneliness. It was received with a mixture of skepticism and gratitude. Elias, who had begun the experiment as a test, became in the year that followed something quieter. A man living with the knowledge that truth can free and wound, that accountability can mend and break, and that love is an action more than a feeling. He walked the village with a cane now, and often sat on a bench where children fed him olive bread and recited stories of the inn's early days. He watched Rose in meetings and felt a peace that came from seeing stewardship embodied. On the day the company announced a return to profit and a new program to train employees in leadership, reporters asked Elias why he had done what he did. He did not craft a lesson, he offered a reflection. "I wanted to know," he said simply, "but knowing alone would have been cruel. What I wanted then, and what we tried to do after, is to make the truth useful, to demand responsibility and offer a path for repair." There was debate about whether his method had been ethical. Many said it was not. Others said that the results, rehiring, restitution, renewed attention to dignity, meant the harm had been contained and redirected toward repair. The conversation never fully closed, and perhaps that was as it should be. Good actions and poor methods can intersect. To hold both realities at once is to practice humility and judgment. In the village, the herbalist watched all of this with the slow smile of someone who has seen seasons enough to know that people are stubbornly changeable. She came to the ribbon cutting, and when Rose found her, pressed a hand into the woman's and said, "You kept the man alive because you tended him as a person, not a project. And you kept us from losing the hands that feed the houses," Rose replied. Elias, watching from a corner, allowed himself to be blessed and, in a quiet way, to bless the people who had gathered. He felt lighter, not because guilt evaporates with action, but because responsibility taken is a different weight than secrets kept. The cameras that had recorded the fall now watched a slow ascent. One not of investors, but of people who had chosen to show up. The final image of the year was not a gala or a trophy. It was a kitchen at dawn, where employees laughed as they shared a pot of coffee, where hands that had been wronged returned to their work with a new dignity, and where a young apprentice read a plaque with names of those who had worked at the inn since its founding. Elias stood at the doorway watching, and felt the answer he had been searching for years ago come into shape. Love is not bought. It is chosen again and again. He never suggested his method as a model for others. He never said that testing the hearts of those you love is noble. He was careful with words in interviews and thoughtful when people asked. "I made choices I might not advise anyone to make," he said one afternoon, voice raw with the admission of a man who had seen the edges of his own fallibility. "But once we had the truth, we tried to make it do good." Rose ran the company with a tenderness that unfamiliar boardrooms noticed. She insisted on metrics that measured human well-being as much as profits: employee retention, supplier stability, local engagement. The company's brand changed. It did not become modest, but it became accountable. In a year, revenues rose by figures that pleased accountants. More importantly, the staff told a different story, that the company remembered who it was made of. There was confession, too. At a small gathering, Frank stood before men and women he had once dismissed and said, "I was wrong. I will spend the rest of my life making that wrong less sharp." It was not a grand absolution, but it was an opening to a humility that had been absent from his life. And Agatha, she and Elias shared a final scene that was quiet and intentional. They met one evening beside the olive trees. the same trees that had been nearly sold and then preserved. They spoke not of vows, but of what it meant to choose kindness anew. There was no grand reconciliation, only a handshake that held years inside it. It was enough for now. 1 year after the stage prognosis, the company announced a scholarship fund, a supplier guarantee program, and a staff leadership initiative. Rose stood beside Elias as the press took their photographs. The billionaire who had pretended to be dying stood straighter than he had in months. He had asked a dangerous question and paid part of the price for it. The price had been humiliation, public debate, and the slow work of making amends. The reward, if it could be called that, was a company that had learned to be stewarded and a family that had been broken and in many ways put back together with different pieces and firmer glue. People asked, was it worth it? The answer was complicated. It had revealed the worst and the best, the frantic greed of entitlement, the small heroic acts of care, the ability for people to change, and the stubborn truth that trust once broken takes time to mend. Elias knew he had done something ethically precarious, and he never insisted otherwise. But he also watched the cooks laugh again as they crowned a new apprentice, and he watched a manager who had been fired get a job with dignity. He watched Rose sign letters that acknowledged debt and offered possibility. For him, that count balanced something in his chest he had felt hollow for decades. In the end, the mansion and the village told the same story with different accents. When wealth is wielded with humility, it can sustain. When it is wielded as entitlement, it consumes. The billionaire had staged a test. What his family did next shocked everyone. Not only because of the party footage or the sales, but because regular people watched a family's moral ledger be tallied and then watched as consequences were met with a mix of accountability and a strained offer of restoration. If you were to ask the village children what the story meant, one of them might say simply that truth matters and that hands fed more than plates. If you asked the old herbalist, she might say that love tends, and tending changes the landscape. If you asked Rose, she would say that leadership is a series of small acts that sum into mercy or neglect, and that she had chosen mercy with rules. Elias did not pretend the experiment was pure. He had been a man tired of guessing and willing to risk the moral hazard of deception to find a truth. He owned that choice and worked in the aftermath to make sure the truth did not become a weapon, but became instead a platform for repair. The cameras that had once caught his family's worst now watched a different kind of labor, the labor of rebuilding. One winter morning, as snow dusted the olive trees and the town wrapped itself in quiet, Elias sat on the bench near the harbor and watched the sea. Rose came and sat beside him. They were not theatrical in their affection. They shared bread and a silence that was full. "You got your answer," she said, not triumphantly, but with the small humor of someone who knows both cost and reward. "I did," he answered. "And I have paid for it in ways I did not foresee. But if it means the people who kept us for so long have their dignity back, then some of the harm I caused has been returned." She took his hand, the same hand she had held in the study months before. "Then do the rest of us right by what we do next," she said. They rose and walked back toward the village where the kitchen fires were already lighting and the day's work had begun. The billionaire who had pretended to be dying had learned at last a lesson not about money, but about measure. That what is counted in profit is trivial compared to what is counted in loyalty. And that stewardship, when practiced, can remake both a company and a family. If this story moved you, share in the comments what you would have done if you found yourself in their shoes. And if you want more stories that test the line between love and wealth, hit subscribe and watch the next tale.